All right, so welcome to the next lecture in XAI, which will be about prototype learning. Again, these slides are by Maximilian Lee, and I will present them to you as best as I can. But yeah, let's start. So what we looked until now, or what we looked at until now, was interpreting given features. So this was rather easy to understand, but limited to the input we have. And we looked at interpreting learned features, which was where we didn't have the need to manually design complex features, but the interpretability is not guaranteed, right? It could be an illusion, or we just don't understand what the model means with it. So what we now want to look at is directly learning interpretable features inside the Latin space of our model, which we then can actually say, okay, this makes sense, what the model learned here. And to give you a little bit of an idea what we mean by this, because the idea is, of course, prototype learning, we look at this animal and try to figure out like what kind of animal is this. And if we look at the beak, could be a bird, maybe. But if we look at the tail, could be also a beaver. If we look at the feet, it could be a seal. And if we look in what it's swimming in, well, it's water, so it could also be a fish, right? So hard to define what the thing is. If we put a head on it, it's probably platypus, but yeah. So it's hard to define like how do we know what kind of animal this is. And the idea we want now is to have a prototype. So to have one single definition of something that represents the whole bunch of different objects that are similar. For example, a robot arm here. Like what would a prototype look like of a robot arm where we can say, okay, it doesn't matter how it looks, it always has like these kind of features. And a prototype can be very different things. For example, it could be a complete training sample we have in our data set. It could be a part of a training sample. For example, if we think about the robot again, one prototype could be that it has a gripper, or that it has different joints or base. Like that could all be prototypes, because all different robots usually also have different joints, maybe have a base, maybe have a gripper. It could be multiple samples merged. This goes also more in the direction than it's done. Could also be a whole training sample, or it could also be an encoded feature representation. And the whole prediction is then based on a similarity measure, because then if we put a new object in there, we can say, okay, this object, what is most similar? What is the most similar prototype for this object? And then we say, okay, it has a base, it has a gripper, so it's most similar to a robot arm. And maybe if it has a beak and a tail and swims in water, then maybe it's most similar to a platypus, something like this. So this is the main idea of the prototype definition. Any questions until now? All right. So prototypes are again based in the vision domain. So just a reminder what a common computer vision architecture looks like. We have our image, we have an encoder, we get a Latin space, we put this in an NLP and then predict something, right? That should already be known. We have an encoding stage, we have a decision stage. I guess we already talked about it enough. So how can we now add prototypes? Well, it's rather easy. We just put them in between, right? We have the encoding stage, and before we make predictions, we actually can learn the prototypes we want to look at. The prototype layer itself can have a different number of prototypes. Usually, you yourself can define them as a hyperparameter, right? And what we then do is each neuron in this layer on the left represents one prototype, and we have a layer which computes the distance from the feature vector to each prototype, so that we know whatever image we put in there, what is the nearest prototype we should put this image onto, right? Because we have, let's say, 10 classes or whatever, then we try to put each class to a respective prototype. There could be also more prototypes, right? We could have 3 prototypes for one class, doesn't matter. But we want to put it near one of our prototypes. And here's a little bit of the more mathematical definition. So we encode our input x to set, and then we say, okay, what is the distance between set and our different prototypes? And then we know what the sample or how close the sample are to the different prototypes, right? Could also be that the sample is in the middle of 2 prototypes, right? Which makes sense, for example, for the platypus. It could be somewhere where there are birds, fish, some seals, and whatever, and it's just in the middle there. So if we now look at the architecture together with the vision encoding and the decision stage, we have our input x, we have our encoder, we get our latent space set, and now we use the prototype, because now we can say, okay, we have some learnable prototypes there. Where in training, where should we put this latent vector to which prototype? And inference, we can see like, okay, where is the latent vector closest to? And then we can use those prototypes, put them again in an MLP, and get our output y. So in general, the prototype idea is just an additional layer in our architecture. The really interesting part comes later, because we need to adapt the loss. Because currently, like, we need to somehow align the different samples with the different prototypes. And this we can do through different loss definitions. But let's first look at the example data set, which we will base or which is based on this paper from 2017. They used the cars data set, where you can see they have different colors, they have different angles, and you need, I think you need to predict the car angle, which has 11 classes, as you can see here. So very simple idea is the prototype size is the entire image, because we always have the entire car, right? And we just take 11 prototypes, 1 per class. So we try to let the model learn that for each angle, or maybe also colors, I don't know, whatever the model wants to learn, right? We want to have 1 prototype to then later see, okay, the model predicted this angle because it used the reference of this prototype, which makes sense. And this is also the part where it then gets interpretable, if we can see this prototype and visualize this prototype. And that's the question, can we actually visualize the prototype? They tried this also in the 2017 paper. We can, but it looks really shit. Like, no idea if you can tell me how the model decided if the car is straight angled or to the right or to the left, but I can't those visualizations. So, of course, they tried to fix this. And before we get to the fix, we need to take a quick detour to autoencoder architecture, just to remind you. Autoencoders, we have an input, we have a bottleneck in the middle, we have an output, and the idea is that we want to give the input in and reconstruct it at the end. That's the whole idea of autoencoders, right? And therefore, we need a reconstruction loss, because whatever input, maybe an image we put in there, at the end, we want to have the same RGB values in our image again. So we can use this as our loss. And this reconstruction loss we can actually also use for prototype learning in our architecture. Because now we can say, instead of just learning the different prototypes, we now also want to decode our latent space. So this means we encode the image, we do something with our prototypes, and additionally, we try to decode the image. And then hopefully, we can then see, okay, whatever the latent space learned is maybe one of the prototypes. So it's an auxiliary head. And it's just a second objective for our task. Maybe to remind you, like the first objective is, of course, to output the correct y, right? If our model doesn't predict the correct y, it's useless. Then also the prototype learning doesn't matter, because if it doesn't predict something correct, then the prototypes also don't make sense. So if we look at both losses, for the task loss and for the reconstruction loss, we get a loss that looks something like this. Very simple, right? We have the task loss, we add the reconstruction loss with some lambda. So maybe now the prototypes look good. Well, they don't. So even if we try to reconstruct the images, it still looks shit. And don't ask me why this one image there looks like some planet. No idea why it's not the same as the others. But I guess in the paper they describe it. So the prototypes here, they are collapsing, and we want to avoid this. So we can add additional losses. For one, we can have a loss where each prototype should be close to at least one training sample. So if you think about it, we have a prototype and it's somewhere in our Latin space and it's just going around there without really being near some of the training samples. This results in something like this, because it's taking some information from that training sample, some information from that training sample, but it's never near one of them. So we try to push the prototype to at least one training sample, so that we want, when we reconstructed the prototype, that it looks similar to that training sample. So we again have the R1 loss, which just minimizes the distance between one of the embeddings and one of the prototypes. So now we can actually visualize them, and they actually look something like cars. But what is the main problem with the prototypes now? Yes?
They all look the same. Almost all.
Yes. They look like the training samples, but they represent the most common classes, right? So the prototypes, even though they minimize the distance between the training samples, because there are a lot more training samples of cars looking straight, a lot of the prototypes just go to those training samples in the training process. So, but there's also a fix for that. We can now say that each training sample should be close to at most one prototype. So we try to get like this, not one-on-one matching, but this kind of one cluster of one prototype being near to the training samples, and then another prototype being near to another cluster of training samples, so that we actually represent every different classes we have in our model. And this we can do again through minimizing the R2 loss. And now we have a rather big loss function with the task loss, reconstruction loss, R1 loss, and R2 loss. And we actually get prototypes that look like the different classes we trained on. Now, what do the prototypes tell us about predicting the angle of the car? Like what seems to be important and what is not important? Rather simple question, yes.
The color doesn't seem to be important. The direction of the car is usually important.
Yes, exactly. So the color, the model does not care if it's red, green, or whatever. Like to predict the correct label, it represents them in a different angles. Of course, that's a very simple example, right, of prototype learning. Like the classes or the images are on the whole, the classes are on the whole images. We only have 11 classes, but it showcases like what we could do with prototypes. Any questions until here? Yeah.
Is this loss specific for this data set, or is this a general?
This is a general loss.
For all prototypes?
This is a general loss. So the task loss is 100% general, because you always want to have this loss in your function or in your models. The reconstruction loss depends, right, if you actually want to reconstruct something or not. And R1 and R2 losses are important so that you don't get this collapse of prototypes, and that you actually have different prototypes representing different training samples. And as I said, in this case here, we could also use 20 or 30 prototypes, doesn't matter, because then some prototypes just represent similar classes, right? That could be, but it's not that bad. It's just important that you have enough prototypes to represent all the different features in your data set. Oh.
Can you explain how the R2 loss enforces that there's only, or that there should be at most one prototype per samples? Because it just minimizes the distance between samples and prototypes.
Yes, let me have a look for the other loss. Is it the same loss?
But the other one, I
Oh,
think step one goes over J, which is the prototypes, and the other one goes over the index I, which is the samples. But apart from this, it's the same equation.
Okay, then let me rephrase the sentence. It's not to at most one prototype, but at least to one prototype. Okay, so the next thing, we want to look at prototypical parts. So instead of having the whole image as one prototype, we can now say, okay, maybe there are different prototypes in one image. And this is what this paper from 2019 does. This looks like that, where there is a bird data set, and it's actually annotated with different parts in the birds themselves. And now we can use different prototypes to represent different parts in the image. For example, the head, or something like the belly, or the feathers, or the feet, and so on, and can then say, okay, we can use those prototypes to then predict maybe what class of birds it is. Of course, all birds have a head, but maybe it looks a little different, right? And this is where we can have multiple prototypes which all focus on different kinds of heads, maybe. So now we have a complex and high resolution data set, a non-uniform background. So that's maybe also important. The cars data set had always a uniform background. As I said, like the cars data set is very, very simple. We have varying poses within the same class. So if we have this bird again, it could look from a different angle and so on. So the prototypes need to learn to generalize on this and not just focus on one of the viewpoints. And in this case, we have no decoder, so we cannot really reconstruct the prototypes we learned. But we have a heat map activation, so we can actually see what part of the image was now important depending on a specific prototype, right? So we can say, okay, I want to see what did this prototype focus in this image, and then it sees, okay, it's the feet, and then we can say, okay, probably this prototype learned to identify the feet of the bird. And this is what I mean, now the reconstruction loss is just tossed away, and we just need the other three losses. All right. There are additional optimizations for the prototypical parts. So for one, we can have prototype projection where we don't have a decoder and still want to visualize the prototypes. So we project the prototypes on the nearest training samples. So this means we input whatever image and then see, okay, the prototype and see what is the nearest training sample this prototype learned on. And then we can say, okay, this should be the thing the prototype learned. This also does not change convolutions on Latin space, so it does not change the whole architecture, right? And we can do the convex optimization. Here we want to have a sparse last fully connected layer. And for each class, the prototypes or all other classes in the sparse layer should have the value 0. And then we don't have a negative reasoning, so we can also have like this additional optimization where we then say, okay, each class has like one entry in this fully connected layer. So one more step is that we can even go smaller, right? Because currently we looked at like this whole image, then we looked at parts of the image. So what happens, input size, then parts of the image. So what happens if we now go down to single pixels? And this is quite interesting because now we are not at this classification task anymore or bounding box task, but now we could also do semantic segmentation tasks, right? Where in each image, each pixel corresponds to some specific prototype. And this was done in the proto-sec paper from 2023, where they actually showed, like, if we input the cat, we can have different activations of the different prototypes. Like prototype 1 activation seems to be focusing on the nose, maybe a little bit on the ears. Then we have, and it can also be visualized. I think it's just Maybe that's actually the nearest training sample. I'm not quite sure, but you can see here it focuses on the nose. Prototype 3, for example, focuses more on the mouth and maybe additionally the eyes. And you can also see it here, more on the neck. And then prototype 4 actually focuses on the whole body of the cat. And this is really pixel-wise, right? So each pixel corresponds to one specific prototype. But the question is now, how can we learn diverse prototypes which cover the entire input? And in the paper, they did this with an additional loss where we treat the prototype activation as a distribution. And now we can use the Jeffreys divergence between different prototypes of the same class. So they are forced to activate on different parts of the image. And as you can see here, like if we don't use this, let me see if we have the loss here, yes. If we don't have this additional loss, usually the activations look pretty much similar of all different prototypes, right? And if we have this loss, we can here see, let me see, that's the upper part of the car, I guess. Here's the lower part. This one is more on the front, and this one is maybe the lower part of the car. So instead of having like these fixed vectors, we just say, okay, our prototype activation is now a probability distribution or distribution, and we now try to separate those different prototype distributions and say, okay, this distribution should focus on this area of the image, this one and that one, and so on. And this actually also improves the model's performance on the semantic segmentation tasks. Any questions until here?
Can you explain again why do we want that prototypes of the same class activate on different parts of the image? Because like a prototype should represent always like one specific thing of the image, right?
Yes, but we can have multiple prototypes for one class, right? Mm-hmm. And one class in this case means, I don't know what like should be semantic segmentation. So I don't know what the class is, but we could have, if it's just about segmenting the car as a car, that you can have multiple prototypes which correspond to the label car, but focus on different parts of the car to then say, okay, this part is important, this part is important, this part is important, and then we have a whole car.
You always have the same amount of prototypes for each class?
That's a good question. Not necessarily. You can have different numbers of prototypes for different classes. I try to remember what we had one master student who did this. And I think in his work, there were actually different numbers of prototypes per class. And there was also the question if it would be reasonable to make this learnable, to learn how many prototypes do I need per class. Because currently you predefine it, right? Or you try out different values, and then usually you have the same amount of number, but you can also tweak the number. But it would also be interesting to actually learn it in the process to say, okay, for this class, I only need one prototype because it's a very simple class. And for other class, I need multiple prototypes because it consists of different parts.
So there has not been work yet in that direction.
I don't know, because I'm not that deep into the prototype stuff. But I don't think there is extensive work on it.
If you have already some neural network and that can predict something, then why did you need prototypes and how we will use it?
Because it's interpretable.
So you can already predict with neural network
of course,
some stuff.
Of course.
Then why you need prototypes then?
Because it's interpretable. This is the only thing you want to use here, right? You want to have this intermediate layer of prototypes, which makes your whole model more interpretable, to understand why did the model now predict what it predicted. And we use, in this case, prototypes to explain, okay, it focuses on this part of the image, or this prototype corresponds to this bird part or whatever. So this is the whole idea. Like if you look into the papers, there are usually baselines which do not use any prototypes, right? and they usually perform better because you again have this trade-off of being explainable or having a higher performance. But currently, and also in this paper, the prototypes now actually can improve results, right? For the segmentation, for example. So baseline methods are actually now worse compared to the prototype stuff. So the whole idea of the prototype thing was having an intermediate, interpretable kind of representation. And now the next goal is to have this kind of representation and then through this representation actually also increase the performance. But sure, you can always have a black box model that just predicts something, but the whole lecture will be about how can we make this explainable, right? Yeah.
Maybe some kind of stupid, maybe meta question for the segmentation prototyping. I would now ask myself, why did it decide to do those prototypes? Because, for example, on the bottom, the one which kind of shows the front and a little bit the bottom, I would not know why did we decide that this is an important prototype for identifying a car, and why, for example, I did not choose to focus on the tires, for example. With all other prototype methods, I kind of it kind of was intuitive why they choose those ones, but for at least for this one, I would now try explaining the explanation. Is that done?
I don't know. I guess you would have to read the paper. I don't know if they try to explain why the model focuses on different parts. But I would recommend looking to the paper because they will have for sure some explanation why the model then focuses on those specific car parts.
Okay, thank you.
So we are also facing the problem of the illusion of interpretability in prototypes.
I would say in this one, maybe. In the other ones, not necessarily, because there you really have, for us, understandable interpretation, right? And it's intrinsically learned, right? It's not post hoc. We don't train a black box model and then try to explain it. We try to train the model directly, also using the explanations. So, but as I said, maybe read through the paper. I guess they do a much better job than I for explaining what exactly we can do with those prototypes. But yeah, there's always the danger of the illusion of interpretability or explainability. All right. So the last part will be rather short. It's just about prototypes without backpropagation, because currently we learned all prototypes. So through our backpropagation process, they were initialized at random and optimized with backpropagation. But there are also non-learnable prototypes. So we can actually try to have prototypes which we do not optimize during training or optimize outside of the backpropagation. And these are external clustering algorithms. For example, cluster by training classes. This would be one thing to get those prototypes. Or we try to predict the nearest cluster center. But this is just a little bit of an outlook. We don't go deeper into that one. But there are papers out there which learn prototypes without, or they learn non-learnable prototypes. All right. So I guess we are at the end for this lecture. Do you have any questions before we go on to the 5 and 5? All right. Then you have 5 minutes to prepare some questions and then we will exchange them.
Yeah.